Here are the solutions to the one sample significance testing multiple choice practice questions. So in the first question, based on this p-value, you're supposed to make a conclusion, but that p-value is a huge p-value. So we're not going to be rejecting the null hypothesis here. We're not going to be getting a statistically significant result. So we can already eliminate these two answer choices right here. So we should be looking at one of the answer choices where the result is not statistically significant. And this is the one down here. This is the correct answer because it uses the definition of a p-value. P-values assume if the null hypothesis is true, it's the likelihood of a sample statistic or a test statistic as or more extreme than the one we've observed. It will only happen about 24% of the time. That's what the definition of a p-value states. So on question number 2, the first thing to notice is the question asks, could this be used to conduct a test of the null hypothesis? Here's the null hypothesis against this alternative. So the first thing is, yes, we can do a test by using this confidence interval because confidence intervals correspond to two-sided tests, and I know that this is a two-sided alternative, so I know the answer has to be a yes. So the next thing to do is consider the difference between these two answers. So in this answer, it says the null hypothesis would be rejected. This one says the null hypothesis would not be rejected. So if you go look at your confidence interval, the null hypothesis of 40,000 is not in that interval. That means that it would be rejected in favor of the alternative. So we could conclude that the mean family income is significantly different from 40,000 at the 2% level. Again, notice that the 2% level and the 98% confidence level, those add up to 100%. So a double-sided test at the level of significance alpha, if you take 1 minus alpha, in this case that would be 0.98, that gives you the level of confidence that the corresponding confidence interval would use, so that the test and the confidence interval correspond. So for question number 3, this is all about which will give you the greatest power. So it's important to review then what greatest power means, how we get that. Higher power is achieved by higher sample size or higher levels of significance. So if all you do is look at the sample sizes, notice we've got to choose one of these two answers. Those are the higher sample size, 20 versus 10. But then between these two answers, we want to choose the higher level of significance. That's the 5% level of significance. So this answer, sample size of 20, level of significance 5%, that would give us the highest power, given the cases that are in front of us. So here, notice we're trying to determine which of these statements is appropriate. And when I read them, notice the statements are either about the null or the alternative hypothesis. And the first thing that I did was I ditched the two answers about the null hypothesis because the null hypothesis is always an equation, at least when we're dealing with tests involving means. So here, I can't have a null hypothesis value that involves less than 65 or greater than 65. So that's the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed is here, we're interested in this claim that we're exceeding the posted speed limit. So we should be looking for a greater than alternative, and it's this one here. The alternative would be that the mean speed of drivers on this highway is greater than 65. That's what the exceed signals for us. So on question number 5, so here, instead of a normal distribution, why is the t-distribution being used? Well, think about t-distribution. The reason we're using the t-distribution is because we are estimating, notice I made the t bigger here, when you are estimating the population standard deviation with the sample standard deviation, that added variability, because the sample standard deviation could be too high or too low, that added variability is accounted for with the t-distribution. That's the answer here, the increase in the variability of the test statistic due to estimating the population standard deviation with the sample one. That's why we're having to use the t-distribution instead of the z-distribution, or rather the normal distribution. So for question number 6, understand you want to find the largest level of confidence where the confidence interval will not contain 0. So this is about This is about the correspondence between a confidence interval and a significance test. So first of all, we can do a confidence interval. We can correspond the confidence interval and the significance test because the alternative hypothesis is a not equal to. It's a two-sided or a two-tailed alternative. So a two-sided test can correspond approximately to a confidence interval. So the next thing we should do is think about what levels of significance will correspond to these levels of confidence. So they should add up to 100%. So a 90% level of confidence should correspond to an alpha level of 10%. 95 will correspond to alpha of 5%. 98 will correspond to 2%. 99 will correspond to 1%, and then 93 will correspond to a 7% level of significance. So the next thing to be mindful of is the word not here. So if the confidence intervals does not contain 0, what that means is we are rejecting the null hypothesis. So we have to decide if this is our p-value, which of these levels of significance, which of these alphas will let us reject our p-value. So the p-value has to be smaller than the level of significance. And there are only two possible answers now. The p-value of 0.056 is less than 10% and it's less than 7%. So those are the two possible answers. But then the next thing to be mindful of is this. I want the largest level of confidence, that will not contain 0. So among these two answers, 90% versus 93%, the 93% is the largest level of confidence. This is a relatively tricky question because it involves multiple layers. So you have to realize you can use a confidence interval because it's a two-sided test. You have to think about how the level of confidence and alpha relate. Then you have to worry about the word not here. You have to think about what that means in terms of rejecting and not rejecting the null hypothesis. Then you got to go back and compare your p-values. And then after you've done that, then you can choose the highest level of significance. It's a great review problem, but there are a lot of elements to that multiple choice question. So last, same thing here. This is similar to a previous question. We're interested in increasing the power in this context. So remember, what increases power? Higher power comes from higher sample size or higher levels of significance. So notice, I don't want to go from a 5% level to a 1% level. That would decrease alpha. That would decrease my level of significance. That would lower my alpha. That would rather lower my power. Same thing. I don't want to decrease the sample size from 100 to 50. That will decrease my power. What I want to do is increase the sample size to 200. That's what will increase power in this context.